Hi, this is Mike Marshall, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who plays bluegrass.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Bluegrass Jam Along. First thing is apologies for there being no backing tracks this week. I've had COVID for the last 2 weeks and just haven't really managed to get around to it. But that's all behind me now, and we'll crack on with some more tunes next week. But what I have had time to do was catch up with Mike Marshall, and that's the interview you're about to hear. And it was an absolute treat chatting to Mike. If you don't know who Mike Marshall is, where have you been? Mike is just one of the most incredible mandolin players and just such a prominent figure over the kind of acoustic scene in the US over the past sort of several decades, really. I mean, just, the list of people he's played with. Jerry Douglas, Bela Fleck, Tony Rice, Mark O'Connor, Stefan Grappelli, Darrell Anger. He's duetted with Chris Thile. He's recorded Bach. He's, immersed himself in Brazilian choro music. He's a traditionalist and a progressive, and you'll hear a bit about that in the interview. We also chat about his teaching, we chat about his collaboration with Northfield mandolins, and just get deep into all sorts of stuff. It's just a great conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. I'm not going to hang around. I'm going to just introduce it now, and you can crack on. There's a couple of other podcasts Mike's done in the past where, kind of as I usually do, I'll link them in the show notes. So rather than Mike sort of repeating his life story here, you can just go listen to those because they're great, and I'm not going to improve on those. So here's our conversation. Mike Marshall on Bluegrass Jam Along. So Mike Marshall, welcome to Bluegrass Jam Along.
It's so nice to be here. A world I've been jamming along in for quite a few years.
You've been jamming along in quite a few worlds, from what I can gather. I think that's one of the most interesting things. I think I first encountered you when I started playing mandolin, and I think it was an episode of Wood Songs with you and Chris Thile.
Oh, wow,
and you did your duets project. And so I listened to that, and I thought, wow, I didn't know music could sound like this. And then just sort of followed some threads and found your work with David Grisman, and then some of the Brazilian choro stuff that you've done. And it came pretty clear pretty quickly that you cover a lot of bases musically, and I found that fascinating. And sort of wondered how, if in your mind there's much distinction between those things, if they all feel like the same kind of thing. They're just different expressions.
Well, no, they're distinct. Clearly, they have different histories and a different musical language and a different swing to each of them rhythmically. And you've got to kind of dive in and understand all that stuff and be willing to kind of shed your old skin and take on something new and really absorb it as much as you can, especially if it's from a really different place than where you grew up.
Well, I find that sort of endlessly interesting because, obviously I'm getting into playing bluegrass, but I grew up in the UK, kind of well away from the tradition of all that. And that sort of question of a connection to the music, I think, is fascinating because you sort of grew up in Pennsylvania, then Florida. Is that right?
That's right. Florida is when I got into music. We moved there when I was about 11 or 12. I had been taking a few guitar lessons in Pennsylvania, but didn't learn that much. It was when I got to Florida and hooked up with a great teacher as a youngster, and he played all the different string instruments, and we started our first teenage bluegrass band with some of his students. And that introduced me to the world of bluegrass. I mean, I was coming at it from the beginning as a foreigner, much like you would living in a different place than the music, Our family didn't know anything about the music, for instance, even though I got into it in the South. We were Northerners. So I've always thought of music as something you come to from another place, And of course, living in the South as long as I did and getting so involved in it in the early 70s and meeting all the great players at the festivals that were happening at that time. When I moved to California to join David Grisman's band, some of the bluegrass pickers out there thought of me as like the real thing, somebody from the South. I always thought of that as kind of ironic. And maybe I was. I mean, I think that these lines do get a little fuzzy once somebody does the work that's needed to be done, then they do become a part of the fabric of what that music is, even if they're not from that place.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting perspective because, particularly with the music like bluegrass, sort of, although it was localized in a particular place, it came from all over the place. Like, it came from Africa,
That's the thing I
it
always
came from
try to
Europe,
remind
and,
people of.
it may have been raised somewhere, but it wasn't necessarily sort of conceived there.
It is a fusion from its inception. I mean, everything American is. We all came from all these different places, and we crashed into each other and created bluegrass and rock and roll and country music and jazz and all these forms that are now traditional, quote unquote. But
Yeah.
at their inception, they were a mixture, and so that's that meeting point is the thing that's always interested me about all kinds of music.
Yeah, and I think there is that. I think there's a sense with bluegrass because a lot of the source material was traditional, the fiddle tunes and a lot of the songs that were sung. But it is a traditional music, and it is an entirely sort of invented thing, invented relatively recently.
That's right. I mean, it certainly they were drawing from the great British Isles fiddle traditions and all the great songs, sea chanties and religious songs that came over with all the immigrants from that part of the world. But the rhythm, of course, changed immediately once it connected with the African roots that were in place, and the swing of the blues is so much a part of everything American. And then as you go forward in the development of the music with Bill Monroe, I mean, he was a songwriter. He wrote his own songs, and all the guys who came after him wrote their own material. So that's all new music. All of his great instrumentals that we think of as traditional bluegrass, he actually wrote a lot of that stuff on the mandolin. Earl Scruggs writing banjo tunes. And so as the music got into the 30s and 40s and 50s, it became very much a fusion. And the guys were pushing the envelope technically on their instruments way beyond what the generation before them had ever done. And my theory on that is because their generation was the first to hear radio. And that's what really gave birth to bluegrass. It was the fact that these hillbillies were hearing other music from the big cities, whether it was jazz or classical music or popular music.
And I think that's really true of like where and when I grew up. The Beatles were, the Beatles had only disbanded a few years before I was born, and they were still a huge thing. But they lived in a port city and had access to music coming in from all over the world that other people didn't necessarily. And it is, I think it's true, maybe that the Beatles didn't just arrive and invent pop music. The Beatles synthesized like Buddy Holly.
I knew that about Liverpool.
Yeah,
it was a very hotbed of mixing of worlds.
It's sort of the port on that side of the UK that everything came in and out of to go to the States. So they would get blues records in Liverpool and rock and roll, and things would come back through the docks, and be around before some other cities got them. And like the Beatles are seen as having invented something, but actually what they did was just synthesize the whole load of things like the Everly Brothers and, early country music and, put it together and put their own spin on it, in the same way that Mozart didn't invent any genres of music. He was just incredible at all the ones he found himself working with. And so I think that's endlessly fascinating.
I've always thought of that, like, why is British pop music so good? Why is there such a long history of great music coming out of there as opposed to some of the other European countries? And I always thought of the blues fanatics who were collecting a lot of that music. The African influence on American music played a part in that. That's my guess.
And language probably helps, having songs sung in a language that travels. But yeah, totally. Britain has definitely punched above its weight and its size in terms of contribution to pop music. And it's really interesting hearing you talk about bluegrass in that sense as a thing that is relatively recent. And this sort of small period of its inception is seen as a almost sort of holy grail thing. And yet the music moved on pretty quickly, and
It sure did.
that original inception of it was actually pretty progressive in itself at the time.
Extremely. I always try to remind folks of that what Bill Monroe was doing on the mandolin, nobody had ever done that. He was the David Grisman or the Chris Thile of his day. And then you look at Earl Scruggs and what he did to the banjo. What is so traditional about that? It was the most modern, freaky thing anybody could ever have imagined at the time. Now, the records had such a big influence on the whole culture of people that it has become iconic, and now it wants to be etched in stone by the next generation, and that's the way you have to play it. I get that. It's understandable how it could have that kind of influence and that kind of magnitude to where you would want to just hold it in time and not let it change.
I think that's also true of anything that we love. I think
sure.
There's a group of people who love jazz who want it to sound like it sounded in the 50s, and but there's also with bands even, there's always a fraction of people who go, oh, I love their early work, like I like the first couple, and like we like if we love something, we sort of want to preserve it in this weird, like pin it down like a butterfly.
Well, when it has that kind of influence on us, and it just blows our mind, especially when we're at a certain age. I mean, that's powerful stuff, and it gives, you want to hold it. There are early classical musicians who want to play on period instruments, and I get that. The music sounds different and it feels different with a Baroque bow and gut strings on a violin. That's a whole other sound, and I love that there are people who want to do that. I've always been one to kind of push at the boundaries. I always thought there's two worlds, and they both have tons of validity, reaching forward with one hand towards where the music might be able to go, but at the same time reaching backwards and understanding where it came from. And just as much as I'm thought of as a progressive bluegrass musician, I mean, I really appreciate the bands that came before. And, when I hear Tony Rice and the Bluegrass Album Band, and that sort of iconic sound of that music that's never been played as well before or since, I love that. And I want to go back there as a source material, for anything I'm doing. That's where I go.
It was a great quote. I listened to a podcast that you did, quite a random sort of, a guy called Michael Marshall just interviewing other people called Mike Marshall or Michael Marshall. And
oh, right. Did that finally come out? I hadn't heard that one.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's such an interesting angle to come at it from. But I'll put a link in the show notes so people can go and listen because it's great. But you said this, I stand on the shoulders of this great tradition. I think it's our responsibility as musicians, if we're going to push forward, we also have to reach back almost with equal force. And I think that's a lovely way of kind of capturing the power of both of those things. Because if you're going to progress, you have to progress from somewhere.
That's it. And I certainly can hear when a musician who calls himself a bluegrass musician is their only reference point is stuff that's come out in the last 5 or 6 years. That's and then when somebody's understanding something a little deeper, and then you can go further back. You can look at the old time music. The fiddle tunes from that Bruce Molsky and folks like that. Then that's God. How deep can you go? You can just keeps going, right?
I mean, that's the joy of music, isn't it? You find a thing, and then you start pulling on the threads and see where you end up. And you might love an album that came out last week, and it takes you back to something from 200 years ago. I'm
also one who believes everybody's entitled to their window in. For me, it was things like the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band in the mid 70s, or the Will the Circle Be Unbroken albums, or John Hartford. I mean, because I was that age and that music was coming out, and that led me to Doc Watson and Bill Monroe and Ralph Stanley. But for somebody that's slightly older than me, like David Grisman, for instance, who I worked with, for him, Will the Circle Be Unbroken wasn't that interesting. because it was this hippie band from California that were younger than him putting that thing together, and he liked the original recordings of those songs. So I kind of get that, you know. Well, going back to your original idea of, hey man, you got to hear the real stuff. It's here, you know. It's earlier is always better.
And there's that whole, you know, I guess I'm part of a generation that the window in was Oh Brother, you know, like
Yeah,
Oh Brother Where Art Thou
exactly.
came out, and that you know that might get you in on one level.
Mine
But
might have
then,
been Deliverance, you know.
yeah, yeah,
Another movie, and those are powerful moments in culture when it. Carol Anger has a theory that it's like the cicadas. They come back every 7 years. You need a movie to remind Americans what their traditional music sounds like.
yeah. I love that idea. I love that, and that's Deliverance is a really interesting example of that, because not only did it introduce the music, it also maybe added some weight to an unhelpful stereotype around the music. And I was listening to something Bela Flack was chatting about the other day about his new album, and he's just saying he always felt a drive to, in some way, reclaim the banjo and have it associated with stuff that wasn't just that, much as he loves bluegrass and fiddle tunes. And he sort of felt, and I wondered what your experience was with the mandolin, because the mandolin is culturally, there's less weight of expectation on it because it has more connotations.
That's true. It's got a sort of wider tradition of cultures that it's been a part of. And yet there's still that, you know, mandolin means Italian music, especially in Europe, you know. Living here puts a whole nother spin on that whole question for me. Not only the mandolin, but bluegrass. And what does bluegrass mean in Germany? You know, it means, well, maybe Bonanza or the Beverly Hillbillies, maybe, but certainly it's just a very shallow thought about what is country music, what is bluegrass. I come from Alabama with a banjo on my knee. You know,
yeah.
And the mandolin, of course, there's just no association with it culturally in terms of bluegrass or funk, anything rhythmically funky. And except, of course, there are circles of folks here who understand much deeper than that, but I'm just speaking in a general sense. So yeah, I've kind of been on a crusade my whole life to show that the mandolin was capable of so much more, and to look at and to use it as a vehicle for looking at all these different styles of music around the world and to learn.
And I think that's a really interesting facet of the music over the past sort of few decades, because it certainly feels like with you on mandolin, with Bela on banjo, and with Jerry Douglas on dobro, this sort of sense of a bunch of players taking an instrument that might be seen as quite confined to one thing and going, you can do anything on this. Watch, I'll show you. And the places that's gone, you know, while at the same time remaining really sort of grounded and rooted in the American acoustic tradition as well.
Probably what drew me to the instrument in the first place was the fact that it hadn't been explored as much as, say, the guitar. You know, if you look at the guitar in the 20th century, it's just like, whoa. And so I love this idea that this little instrument could be taken to so many other places. It just seemed like wide open possibilities, terrain to look at.
And at what sort of point in that journey did the classical stuff come in? Was that quite an early development?
It actually was pretty early. I was taking violin lessons. It was the same teacher that taught me mandolin and guitar might have shown me a violin and showed me how to hold the bow. That was about it. So I kind of dove into studying on my own, and then just found my way somehow towards violin method books and things like the Wolfart studies and the different method books from the 19th, early 20th century, and just started playing that music, not only on violin, but on mandolin too, because there were no mandolin methods that I knew of at that time to really study the classical mandolin. So I immediately found my way to Bach, probably as a 17-year-old, and thought, well, this is some amazing music that seems impossible to play on the mandolin, and yet maybe it's not. And so spent many years diving into it. Might have recorded the first, I recorded the E major prelude to the third partita of the solo violin repertoire on my first record on Rounder. When was that? 1982 or something. So I always felt like, gosh, somebody should record all of this stuff. Maybe I can. And it would be, 30 years later before Chris Thiele would record half of it. And we're still waiting for that second half. It's just really deep music, and it can be played on the mandolin. I think we know that now. Technique had to get a little bit better, at least from the bluegrass and folk mandolin. Mandolin has always gone up and down in terms of its involvement as a serious classical instrument within classical music. And, you could say that the period after the great mandolin orchestra period of the teens and the 20s, that the mandolin kind of went into a sleepy period and became like a folk instrument in America, and is now finding its way out of that period into a more serious instrument that's capable of a lot more. I like to think I'm part of that move.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's happened.
And it is interesting, isn't it? It's that idea of windows in. Like, for a generation, mandolin probably means losing my religion. And some people have gone, what's that? What's that?
Maggie May.
Your Cophead Road or whatever. And
right. You could add a little tinkly on top of a pop song.
Yeah.
Right. Boy, we've come a long way, haven't we?
Totally. And I think this is a great point about the mandolin sort of being ripe for exploration still. Because it's got that thing of,
oh my gosh,
it's got that thing of being the same tuning as a violin. So there's, centuries worth of applicable repertoire if it's adapted, as you say. But at the same time, it's a very different method of tone production. So it requires a totally different approach at the same time as that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I started in my modern mandolin quartet for that reason. First time I played a mando cello was probably at David Grisman's house when I joined his group. And I immediately thought, well, wait, you've got mando, cello, mandola, tuned like a viola, and two mandolins. Why not do a string quartet with these instruments? So we did that for about 10 years and recorded like 3 or 4 records for Windham Hill. And it was a great experience. That was a way for me to study classical music as much as anything, because as a mandolin player, you weren't going to get hired in a symphony, or there wasn't enough repertoire around to justify it being a member of a chamber ensemble. So I thought, well, we're going to have to just do this ourselves. If I want to learn how to play Debussy or Mendelssohn or Bach in an ensemble, we're going to have to just do it with a mandolin group. And it was a great experience, great way for me to study that music and get to learn and play that music.
I guess if you're a professional classical mandolin player, you might occasionally get a call if they're doing Don Giovanni at the Opera House, but that's probably it.
Exactly. No, you wouldn't get the call because they would just have one of the violin players.
So you don't even get the one gig there is.
That's right. And, that's what's so fascinating about another aspect of being in Germany here. Is that now my wife, Katharina Lichtenberg, has what is probably the only position in a music conservatory where you can study mandolin at a serious level. And so since meeting her, I've learned about all this repertoire that the mandolin has for itself that I knew nothing about, being an American coming from bluegrass. Folks like Rafael Kalache and Kurohara, a great Japanese composer that wrote a lot of stuff for solo mandolin. So that's been a great experience for me, seeing how she runs her school and all of her students coming out of there.
We'll be right back with you just after this. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins. If you're attending the NAMM show in January, stop by the Collings booth to say hello to the team, get hands-on with their selection of customised acoustics and electrics, and check out some exciting new prototypes they're working on for 2024. They'll also have a few of their world-class artists on hand demoing various instruments. And if you can't attend, don't forget to follow their Instagram and Facebook accounts throughout the show for photos, videos, and the latest news. Collings guitars are hand-built from the sound up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If one of your 2024 resolutions is to improve as a musician, Peghead Nation is the place to go. They have 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music. Courses cover bluegrass, old-time, Irish music and swing, plus lessons dedicated to improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 a month, and you can add more for $10. Try any course free for a month with the promo code JAMALONG. Make 2024 a year of more music at pegheadnation.com. Well, that sort of provides quite a nice segue to chat about teaching, because I think having broken so much ground and taken the mandolin to new places, teaching's become quite a big part of what you do now. And it seems to be true for a lot of bluegrass players, actually. A lot of bluegrass players seem to teach as well. And I love the way that's, the shift in available stuff now, the amount of access you can have wherever you are in the world to... I get guitar lessons from Bryan Sutton on the Artist Works site, which you also teach at. And that's like, I live in London. Even if I could afford to pay Bryan Sutton to be my guitar teacher, it would cost me more to get there than to pay for the lessons. And
it's pretty intimate, right? I mean, he can really give you the stuff that you need.
Well, I mean, that's
that system.
You actually get somebody looking at the way you play, not just saying, here's how you play Salt Creek. It's like, here's how you can approach it. And I heard an interview you did on the Artist Works podcast, actually, fairly recently. You were talking to Patricia about having reached, I think, 8,000 video responses. And you were basically saying that there's half a dozen key issues that you tend to address over and over again with people. And I was curious to know what they were, what the sort of the main sort of...
Great question. Yeah. One of the things the mandolin suffers from that, say, the violin doesn't, and probably the piano doesn't, is there, especially in American mandolin tradition, is that there was never a conversation about like something as simple as like, how should we hold this instrument? And no thought about ergonomically what works best. When you go take a violin lesson, the teacher immediately deals with that as a 5-year-old kid. First of all, you put the violin under your chin, right? Unlike the old-time fiddlers of the 19th century who might have held it under their belly, way down here, choked up on the bow and held it like a baseball bat, and just fiddle, and turn their hand backwards. And, you can't see this in radio land, but if you're a violin player, you know what I'm talking about. So now you put the violin under your chin, you wear a shoulder rest, so that you don't have to put your neck so far down, all these little details. And you hold your hands a certain way. Here's how you hold the bow. I mean, they can spend a few weeks just talking about that. So I immediately see all those things when people send me a video. That's the beauty of Artist Works, because I immediately get to see how a person is just holding their instrument and whether it's ergonomically working. So a big one is like the mandolin's small. So I like to use a footstool or put my foot on a case, like a classical guitarist would, to get the left leg elevated so that the instrument is sitting on your body at an angle and you're touching on both legs and your chest and your right arm. All these 4 different contact points are holding the instrument steady so that it's not moving around when you're playing it.
Yeah.
Another one is the left hand. Again, just like the violin, not letting the palm of the hand touch the back of the neck, keeping your wrist straight on your left hand. That's another one that I see a lot. There's things like when you play up a string, not lifting the index finger, like because you're going to come back to it. Just simple little ideas like that just leave your index finger down because you're coming back. You don't have to reset it. Pick direction is a big one. Folks tend to want to sometimes play with a lot more downstrokes when they're playing eighth notes instead of playing down up down up. And if they're playing something syncopated, I'm kind of big on this idea that the syncopated notes should be upstrokes and the downbeat notes should be downstrokes. Sometimes folks will play everything with a downstroke, and it's just or they'll only play downstrokes when they change strings. They always use a new downstroke. So a lot of my exercises have to do with getting comfortable with weaving in and out of the four strings with continuous down up, just to get used to that physical sensation.
Yeah, I remember that from buying one of your Fingerbusters books when I started playing mandolin and just getting my head around that.
Okay, you know about that.
Yeah, like a workout for the hands.
10 pages of open strings.
But it's true, getting that stuff right makes such a difference.
I got obsessive, I love getting obsessive about these things.
But I think once stuff like that is internalized and you're not thinking about it, it just frees you up to think about something at a slightly higher level, or a different facet, or the tone you're producing, or musicality, or it's just one less thing to be at the front of your mind, isn't it?
I think that it's a simple thing that can become just muscle memory, and you just do it then at a certain point. You're right. And then you're off to the races. There's another thing about playing rhythm, chop chords, that just to not let it sustain very much. It's really supposed to be a snare drum pop, 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 pop. And so you get this nice tight thing as opposed to letting it ring. It's funny how little things like that, folks, I don't know why it doesn't necessarily register until somebody points it out to them. That's why you have to see somebody playing. It's very hard to learn off YouTube on your own because you just can't see this stuff. You can't see what you're doing when you're doing it.
Totally. And and as much as the advice people give you is to record yourself and film yourself and watch it back, like so many people don't do that. And that's the part of the power of artist works really is just in sitting at home and turning your phone on and recording yourself. And it makes you even before you submit it makes you so aware of what you look like and sound like, and before somebody even gives you feedback, you've learned something.
Well, I have to laugh because some people will say, "Damn, I recorded this thing 10 times before it's got one I could send you." I'm like, "Great, that's wonderful," because I'm already having this effect on you as a student before we even meet. And you're already doing all the stuff that I would have probably told you to do anyway. You're now self-correcting. And so as nerve-wracking as that is for folks to do and to get one that's good enough, I'm always encouraging them to just dive in, give it a go. They'll learn. They'll get better just from that, just from watching themselves. Yeah.
And I think the other thing you get from having a teacher interact with you one-to-one is the flip side of there being so much material out there now. Like there's so much. You sort of need somebody to curate it for you a bit and tell you what you should be focusing on because it's overwhelming.
Yeah, it is. We're living in that time now of, have we gotten to the point where there's enough content now? Can we all stop making stuff?
You can't tell me that. I'll make a podcast. I have to keep making content.
Oh, yeah, of course. That's what we're doing right now. We better keep it up. Because tomorrow this shit is out of date. Nobody cares. You got to get a new one up. I kind of had it with that, I'm kind of getting done with, like, it's just the information age. Okay, great. There's enough out there to work on, and there's enough tunes to learn. And I don't know. I like composing. I still want to compose, but I don't need to see what somebody's cappuccino looks like.
I think I read a book the other. Well, I'm a bit of like it's a bit of an issue for me in that way, in that I love a new idea. I love, rather than implementing stuff that I've learned, I want to learn more things, and it can get in the way sometimes. And I read a great book the other day that just said like, instead of reading a new book that you think might teach you something groundbreaking, go back to a book that already has. Like, go back to a book that changed your life and read it again, because you would have implemented 10% of what you learned. Like,
Wow.
underline stuff when you enjoy it in a book and go back to it. You don't need another book. You need to
Mm,
absorb the ones you've read.
nice.
You know.
That's a great, great, great idea. That's beautiful. I might do that. I read Moby Dick about 20 years ago. Blew my mind. I might go visit it again.
I love rereading stuff, and it's a bit like what you were saying early on about some of the fundamental things about like just the chop in mandolin. And if you're a mandolin player in a band, most of what you're going to be doing is
Mm.
chopping. So to focus
That's
on that,
about
and
90% of your job.
but we don't spend 90% of our time practicing
Don't
it.
do too many wiki wackies. Just the backbeat is fine. Just to think of the bluegrass band as these interlocking wheels or gears that all have a different function. The bass goes boom, the mandolin goes chuck, the guitar sustains. You don't have to sustain. The banjo's rolling 16th notes, so you don't want to do too much chicka 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 because it's going to get in the way of his dingy 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 dingy.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a beautiful, perfect chamber ensemble, or or it's a drum set. Each guy's a limb.
I mean, I started out as a drummer, and the point that I realised that a bluegrass band is basically a 5-person drum kit sort of blew my
Mm,
mind slightly. And it's such a, when you hear that rhythm just ticking over, it sounds incredible.
mm.
It's a
There you
joy.
go. Those things lock into each other like it should sound like one person. Who's your favorite bluegrass band when you
Oh,
think of that
I mean,
part of it?
I I'm totally with you on the sort of bluegrass album band sort of stuff.
Mm.
But I love hearing how Punch Brothers can take that somewhere entirely different, but it's like a track like movement and location that is so almost
Mhm.
it's almost computer generated, and it's these little patterns that just roll over each other. But
Mhm.
it's also got such a
Mhm.
groove,
That's brilliant.
and
No, it's really,
it's
really
to
cool.
be able to take that living, breathing heart. This is why I love acoustic music: is that every dynamic you want to create, you've got to create it. You can't just turn stuff up and equalize it and whack on your distortion pedal and you wah. You've got to physically create the
Uh,
and just hit so all kinds of acoustic music, whether it's going to see an opera in person or hear a string quartet pass a melody around between them.
that's certainly what attracted me to acoustic music, and why I always came back to it, even though I touched on electric instruments here and there. It's just that there's always felt like a little bit of a disconnect between me and the sound I was making. It was more important the pedal and the amp than it was in the hands. Of course, that's not true when you listen to Jimi Hendrix or some of the greats. You can tell that it is in the hands, but the acoustic thing is just so immediate. It's just right there.
Yeah, yeah. It's like hearing instruments sort of breathe, and just that dynamic
Mm,
range that is possible but requires work is just it never ceases to fascinate me. Um,
great.
Now, it'd be really, really cool to talk around a few of the other bits you've got going on. And we talked back earlier about you were talking about period instruments and playing things on original instruments. And one thing that I think is sort of really cool is that in the last 10 or 20 years, obviously there's this golden age of pre-war instrument building in America, sort of law mandolins and some of the
Mhm,
old Martins. But the quality of instruments
mhm.
available to the general public now has got so much better. And one of the
Yeah,
things you've been doing
yeah.
is working with Northfield mandolins on there to
Yeah,
bring. I've played a few, and they're incredible mandolins that hold their own against some much more expensive ones. And I'm just curious
it's
how
true.
how you got into that, where that started, really.
Well, it started with this relationship with the man who runs the company, Adrian Begale. He was at this workshop that we often teach at in North Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina, called the Swananoa Gathering. And he had a little booth there with some of his instruments. And I had maybe seen one of his instruments. I saw Adam Steffi playing one at our mandolin camp maybe a couple years before that and thought, ooh, that's pretty damn nice. Of course, in his hands, anything would sound nice. So when I met Adrian, I realized that I had a kindred spirit in that here was somebody I could really talk to about mandolins and share with him when somebody builds an instrument, especially a Geppetto type builder that's building one at a time, even though you might love his instruments, it's very difficult to be critical and have a real conversation about, like, well, I like your instruments, but what about this? Can we talk about, is it possible to get more of this or more of that? Maybe because it's so personal to them. It's a piece of art, and to criticize somebody's art is rough.
Yeah.
But with Adrian, it was immediate that, he said, you have one of the greatest mandolins in the world. You're Lloyd Loar. Can we sit down and talk about what we could do with these Northfields to make them come close to the sound that your mandolin has? And also, is it possible to imagine going beyond that? And so I was like, oh boy, let's go, man. Let's have this conversation. It was a lot of hang time, a lot of bottles of wine, a lot of studio time, going in the studio with mandolins, recording the same bit of melodic material or rhythm, so that you could switch on a mixing console between instruments and really hear what you're hearing. So we just, he's just somebody that was capable and willing to go all the way down into the rabbit hole and really have an honest conversation about it. Say, well, this is great, but this part here is. So that's really what it's about. It's about the relationship with him and his builders are. It's funny because he's in Marshall, Michigan.
Yeah.
Places. And now they build the instruments there and in China. And the man who's the head builder is actually Japanese. So he's got these three cultures. And because of that, you have language barriers.
Sure.
And so to have a conversation about tone and to start talking about, well, this mandolin has a lot of woof or a lot of bark or a lot of choppy, or it's bright or it's dark, or it's, what do those words mean in Japanese, and what do they mean in Chinese? What do they even mean in English?
Yeah.
When you say it's got a lot of oomph, or it's got a lot of pop, or it's okay, sustain is sustain, low end is low end, but which part of the low end spectrum are we talking about? So he and I got into this idea of, like, how wines have a flavor wheel. Have you ever been to a wine tasting where they have all the bright colors of, like, grassy and flinty, and grapefruit, and these bright fruits? And then as you come around the wheel, you enter things like plum and chocolate, tobacco, and these dark flavors are on the other side of the wheel. But there's like 25 different parts on the clock. So we got into this idea of creating like a tone wheel so that we could have a conversation about tone and make sure that when you say bright, you're talking about the same thing when I say bright.
Yeah, sure.
Or at least attempt to have that kind of dialogue where we could get in there. And we even talked about frequencies, and we would go in the studio and bring up 2K or 3K or 5K and talk about the differences between those. One is apricot and the other is lemon and the other is pure acid. So this was a great way to just kind of get in there and talk about, wood types and finish types, density of wood, speed of sound on a piece of wood, which I knew nothing about before meeting him. Speed of sound, what is that? Of course, I can imagine it, but here was somebody who could measure it in a chunk of wood that hadn't been shaped yet. So he came over to Europe and went down into the Dolomites and bought a bunch of spruce. He studied with some great builders, Mike Chemnitzer, who builds the Nugget mandolins. He was mentoring with him a bit, and he's also very humble. When we would compare mandolins, and he would, have me and John Reichman's Loars, And then he would have one of his early Northfields. He was the kind of guy that could go like, wow, you guys just kicked my butt. Those mandolins are just sick. And I got to go back to the drawing board here and really, school. And he did. And now he's, of course, he's also conscious of, the fact that he's trying to stay within a certain price point on his instruments. And that was part of what we were all about, was to create something that average player could have and afford and still be a fantastic instrument. And so he's been able to do that, for the kind of money you spend on those instruments. That's a lot of mandolin,
Yeah.
What is it, $7,000 or something? That's like, wow. And I use it.
I remember the first time I played one, I'd heard a lot about them, and there's not many of them over in the UK, but there's a great shop in Brighton that stocks some American-made instruments, and they had 3 in, and I picked them all up, and each one just sounded better than the last. And I'd play on the same day I played an Ellis and some Webbers and some Collings, like I was playing them next to nice mandolins. And just I kept going back to one of the Northfields and picking it up again, and it just had a sort of resonance to it that felt alive.
Yeah. Was it the artist model? Was it the 5 bar?
It was the Big Mon, the F5.
Oh yeah. That's what Adam played. They're doing this thing with trying to build an instrument that's super light and resonant, but that also has some power so that when you lean in on it, it doesn't collapse and distort, which can happen with super responsive instruments, that they don't hold up to heavy playing. Mm-hmm. So he's experimenting with, instead of just having the 2-tone bars, to have 5 little ones kind of placed here and there on the face, so that you still get some support, and yet you've got a very light piece of wood. And there's some other things, as he says, up under the hood that he's not afraid to play around with, tone bar shapes and different graduation points. He did a lot of measuring of old instruments and other builders' instruments to see where they're carving the tops to get certain kinds of sounds, and getting to the point where you can almost dial in certain frequencies by where you graduate. It's very fascinating stuff. I love it.
And it's sort of the point you made about him being humble, and going back to the beginning of this chat about Northfield, and you were sort of saying about being difficult to criticize somebody's art, but you definitely get the sense that somebody, like anybody, I think like most truly artistic minds are aware that their art is a journey and an exploration, and is born out of curiosity as much as anything else. And most truly artistic people, for me, seem the curiosity to keep being curious outweighs the need to show you what they can do. And so if you're dealing with somebody who's aware they're constantly on a journey, then I think that's when those conversations get so exciting, because the curiosity never stops, and that is a really compelling and attractive quality in anybody.
It's certainly what our job is, as I see it.
Yeah, totally. I know. Yeah. It's funny. I had a chat with Tristan Scroggins a few weeks ago, and we were sort of talking about authenticity in music, but also the idea of being authentic to yourself. And it all kicked off with a conversation about Punch Brothers covering Church Street Blues. But the idea that as a musician, your job is there is a unique U-shaped space in the world that nobody else can occupy. And your job is to occupy that space as fully as you can. And that's sort of all your job is as an artist, is to find out who you are and go and be that.
That's it. I love what Tony Rice said about that. So many people try and copy him, and then as you start to look at his interviews and things, he was all about somebody being themselves. That was all he wanted. And his favorite musician was Vassar Clements. This is the most unique violinist of the whole bluegrass world. And I love that. And yet people want to copy him.
Yeah. Well, and it goes back to this conversation.
More than anybody, and try and sound exactly like him.
It goes back to that idea of trying to keep things pinned in a case like a butterfly. Once something exists, we want it to stay that way. And Like those things,
Mm-hmm.
bluegrass and Vassar Clements and Tony Rice were all born out of a spirit of progression and curiosity and creativity.
And I wonder if these things go in wheels, if they're cyclical in terms of the early Bill Monroe with Splat and Scruggs and Benny Martin was super creative.
Mm.
Then the period after that was less creative. Everybody was trying to copy them. And then the period in the early 70s with Newgrass Revival and David Grisman and Tony Rice and Tony Trischka was super explosive. And then the period after that, right around the time of Oh Brother, and you could say Alison Krauss, was a more conservative period. Maybe the Punch Brothers are introducing another new creative wing.
Yeah.
I don't know. And maybe it's human nature to do this, to go through a period of expansion, and then maybe fear strikes in and you want to hold it back because it's going too far. Or maybe it's a product of technology. I was talking about the radio during Monroe's early days affecting how they played music. They thought they were playing jazz, and they were playing some jazz. Limehouse Blues and Farewell Blues, those were swing tunes. Yeah. And then the period in the early 70s was the period when the people from the big cities, the northern cities, got interested in the music. Before that, it was Southern music. But David Grisman is from New York, and Tony Trischka and Matt Glazer and Gus Barenboim, all these guys were from, and all the West Coast guys were finding out about the music. And then they were bringing other influences into it because of where they were from. They were hearing, they grew up on the Beatles, they were hearing jazz, rock and roll, fusion. Then you have, by the time you get to the Punch Brothers, you have the internet.
Yeah.
And so the lid is completely off the pot. And now there's this, okay, now the challenge is, how are we going to deal with all of that stuff that we're finding out about? If you're a 15-year-old kid in East Tennessee and you want to play the mandolin and you look up mandolin, you're no longer Uncle Joe's pick and parlor. You're now in Brazil seeing Hamilton de Holanda, and you're seeing Chris Thile, and you're seeing Mike Marshall and Katarina Lichtenberg play Bach, and Avi Avital playing Israeli stuff. The top of your head comes off, and you've only got 50 years to digest all that and create your own voice within it. That's the challenge.
That's what one of the biggest sort of themes of these interviews that I've been doing has become, really. It's connecting all that together, and this sense that if you start out, that can be overwhelming. Like, there's so much music, and if your first experience of the mandolin is seeing Chris Thile play like Chris can play when he chooses to, you can go, well, this is just a different type of human being for me.
And why bother?
But from talking to Bryan Sutton, talking to Tristan Scroggins, and talking to other people, this real clear sense has definitely come about that everybody's just on a journey, and you start from nothing, and however far you get down that journey, you're still kind of one foot after the other, learning, improving, and there aren't an elite class.
It's pretty much it. We're blessed to have all this access. I wish I could have had all this access when I was that age. I was hungry for it. And yet I was taking it in as best I could. I suppose that's what every musician has always ever done. I mean, Bach did the same thing. He invited everyone he could to his house when they were passing through town. And he was the one who took the English and the French and the Italian, all these different styles of Baroque music, and synthesized them into one thing. The generation before him, I think, was more regional and focused on their own backlog of stuff they had access to. So here we are. We just have to do the best we can. It's all there. You can get information immediately, find out what it is, and then you decide. Yeah, it probably just comes down to passion. if you're passionate about something and decide to get obsessed about it, it almost doesn't matter what it is. And then those collections of things that you're going to choose to pick are going to be who you are. And it'll be as deep as it is that you go down.
Yeah. And if your only way of doing that is to continuously keep dropping a needle on a record to work out how somebody played something because you didn't have the internet to show you, then that's what you do, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. That's what I had to do. I had to wait 6 weeks for it to arrive in Lakeland, Florida. So I wore that sucker out, man. I still have some of them. The early Newgrass Revival records. Just learned every Sam Bush solo note for note that I could, when you could turn an LP down to half speed.
Yeah.
Oh, he slid into that third note just a little bit. Well, let me go back over it.
I think that's the really interesting thing, because we were saying before about these sort of half a dozen issues that everybody faces when you're teaching them on artist works, and all the VEs are out there for everybody to see, and but all of this, like, nothing, you have to learn everything for yourself at some point, don't you? Like however much information there is and however much somebody can tell you something. And it's not the idea of sort of you can read a book and understand something, but then go and reread it and implement it. And it's that, learning is the thing that you have to come to in your own. A lesson is a lesson when you've learned it, not when somebody's told you it exists.
Totally personal. I guess it is. Just when I think about the conversations I've had with Katerina, for instance, how different her world is. And when we played Bach together for the first time, some of the things she might have been yelping about how I was phrasing something. And only now completely understanding what she was talking about. But that's a lot of time. And you just have to, it comes to you, it sort of trickles into you physically over time. It does. Just because somebody says it doesn't necessarily resonate. You're not going to just be able to do it just because I said so. And so I think about that with my students online. Exactly that thing, that it comes, and it also comes from physically being in a room with people playing, and that is the one thing that. It's a hard time now with the whole pandemic and people not being able to hang. When I think about the 100 people that I studied from them through the practice of playing with them, and they taught me, and you just have to be aware of what's going on around you, and it'll come in. And you can't, I think there's certain parts that you can't get any other way. I was talking to Kat about it because she talks a lot in her lessons to her students. Man, my voice is gone. I've been talking for 8 hours. I'm like, Kat, why do you talk so much? I learned so much from you because we played together. Why don't you just play with these kids? And just yesterday she came back. She said, wow. I was playing with so-and-so student, and she just, in the course of the hour, she just got so much better, and it was so much fun. And these little bits of information, you just can't, you can talk and talk and talk and talk, and the student says, yeah, okay, I'll try it. That don't do it.
Yeah.
Get out your instruments, play. And when I think about playing with Tony Rice, shit, man. It was just like it's like a firestorm, an intimate firestorm washing over you, like a bath, but also burning all your skin off and replanting it with new skin that was much better.
Wow.
I don't know. You just can't get that. And he got it from JD, who got it from Bill, who got it from Jimmy Martin, who got it from Bill Monroe. And, So that lineage of apprenticeship is, that's just real. That's real stuff. I think that's how classical music was taught. I think that's how jazz is taught. Indian classical music. I'm friends with Zakir Hussain. We're going to play together actually in a couple of weeks. And, his dad was Ala Raka. And it's, I think, 3 generations of tabla players. And he played, as a kid, he played for all the singers during their lessons. He was their accompanist. So how many melodies did he hear?
Yeah. And it's used to say, you talk about the amount of musicians that came through Bill Monroe's band and went on to be, major figures in their own right. And the same with Miles Davis, the amount of people who started off in Miles Davis's band and went on to, it's all part of the process.
Daryl has this theory that each genre of music is actually created by a very small group of people. About 12, he says. Which is an interesting thing to chew on.
I mean, you can, if you look at, you could, for example, look at the bands that came out of CBGBs in the 70s, and then how many thousands of indie alternative college rock bands, punk bands they spawned over the next 20 or 30 years and still are doing.
Right.
That was
how many groups?
Tiny little place.
Or jazz fusion.
Yeah.
If you're singing jazz fusion, you're talking about Weather Report, Return to Forever, John Lupani, right? Mahavishnu.
Yeah. Well, there's that sort of classic cliche that, the Velvet Underground only sold about 200 records, but everybody who bought one of them went on to be an influential musician,
I like that idea. Because it's like a hotbed of creativity around a certain language that's agreed upon, and I think that gives it a kind of focus and an intensity that's pretty magical. When I think of what I'm doing, say at the Savannah Music Festival with I don't know if you're aware of that workshop I do down there, the acoustic music seminar. It's a super high level thing for young people. I bring 16 kids down there every year, and they work on their own music. They create ensembles, mixing and matching all the different players. And then at the end of the week, they have to play a show and pick the best material that they've worked on. You talk about a boiling pot. Tristan was there. I mean, most of Hawktail were there. Mile 12 all met there. I mean, so many bands have formed out of that thing. And just something I'm really proud of, just to create a kind of bubbling cauldron for them to all work on and work together and then meet each other. Maybe I'm not sure if we have a baby that's been created out of that yet, but
it is, I think, bringing people together, like the ability to bring people together to make meaningful connections is a really powerful and beautiful thing.
I'm pretty proud of some of the things I've created for that, with the mandolin symposium that I did with David and Chris, and now doing this stuff with Katerina, teaching these workshops around. Yeah, the teaching thing it's always been a part of what I do. Maybe because I see myself as a student as much as anything. Kind of why I do this was so that I could learn. And not only learn about music, but learn about everything. The music's taken me all over the world and, introduced me to these different cultures and the history of places. And, that's how I learned about so much was through the music. So this little mandolin.
Long may that journey continue. I think that sort of takes us back to where we started, really, about everything just being a journey and nothing's fixed in time. And that idea of continuing to be curious and creative and move on. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to do this today, Mike. This has been a real pleasure. Is there anything you've got coming up that you want to share with us?
Well, yeah, the show on the 18th of November with Zakir Hussain. I'm going to be a part of that show at the Cologne Philharmonic. I'm very excited about that. He's got he's got great Indian violinists coming in, sarangi player, and a couple other very interesting musicians. It should be a fun show. Then Daryl Enger's coming over here to Germany, and we're going to play with the WDR Big Band. Bob Mintzer from the Yellow Jackets is their arranger, and he arranged a bunch of the tunes from Daryl and my past recordings. And for us with big band, I can't imagine what he's come up with. I'm so excited about that. That's the 18th of
that'll be fun.
December. Yeah.
Cool.
And then I'm going out on tour with Edgar Meyer, Sam Bush, and Edgar's son, George Meyer, in January for a couple of weeks.
Oh, fantastic.
All over the East Coast of the U.S. So that'll be fantastic to hang with those boys and play some of that music. I imagine it'll be a mixture of things we've done with maybe some of the music we did with Bela Fleck on the Trio record, and maybe some of those things with Joshua Bell that we recorded for Sony. George is a monster violinist and can hang with all of that stuff. And it's always a treat to be in the presence of Sam Bush's backbeat, let me tell you.
Yeah, when you talk about chop, there's a mighty chop there.
That is it. That's the beginning and the end of it, as far as I'm concerned. Which is unfair, because it's not the beginning.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much for doing this, Mike. I've really enjoyed this. It's been an absolute treat.
It was a pleasure, Matt. Thank you for taking the time too, and I'll do it again anytime you wish.
Cool. So that was the interview that I did with Mike Marshall. I hope you enjoyed that. I got a lot out of doing it, and I hope you got a lot out of listening to it. We've got another 3 of these lined up over the next coming weeks, so we'll have some more interviews on the podcast before the end of the year. In the meantime, I'll be back with some more tunes next week. Have a great weekend, stay safe, and happy picking. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.